I was recently asked in an email by someone named Betty John, why do I denigrate William Shakespeare? I don't know what you mean by denigrating William Shakespeare. I've admitted Shakespeare is a great writer, was a great writer. There's anywhere from 7 or 8 to maybe a dozen great poems, sonnets he wrote, same number, about 7 to 8 great plays. So he's one of the great English language writers. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. What I've objected to is people calling Shakespeare beyond reproach. There are some smart people who have, shown that Shakespeare had a lot of limitations. His poems are both terrible. I think he only wrote 2 of them. Most of his plays, and he wrote 37 of them, are mediocre to bad. Some of them are terrible, like A Midsummer Night's Dream. People will say Titus Andronicus, but Midsummer Night's Dream is probably one of the plays that people think is very good, if not great. That's really terrible. His comedies are atrocious. William Shakespeare was terrible at comedy. He was best at drama, and his dramatic monologues are amongst the best ever written. Absolutely. And if you took them out of the dramas and made them separate poems, you'd have another maybe couple of dozen great poems you could add to his list. But people don't speak in the iambic way that he wrote, and there's always a falseness about it. The fact that Shakespeare was so out of touch with the realities of his day is a thing that is to be held against him. Of course, even worse than the mindless worship of Shakespeare is when people even more mindlessly foist other people up against Shakespeare as being as good as Shakespeare or whatnot. I recently joined Twitter, and I followed an actress named Katie McLean. She was on the soap opera All My Children, and one of her hilarious tweet posts or whatever was, it simply said, Shakespeare or Spielberg, the innate comparison being, is Steven Spielberg as great as William Shakespeare? Well, it's an absolute joke since Spielberg is one of the worst filmmakers in America, in American history. I mean, he's technically a good filmmaker in terms of his visuals and whatnot, and his editing is fine. But his storytelling is really and truly at an Ed Wood level. You look at his childish films. There's no adult characters in there. There's no depth to it. You look at some of his supposed masterpieces like Saving Private Ryan, which is filled with every character is a cliche. They utter nothing but cliches. It's bigoted and small-minded and xenophobic. You look at Schindler's List, and it's got the depth of a little Lulu cartoon. I mean, you can't compare him to someone like Kubrick. And this idea when Spielberg was trying to say how friendly he was with Kubrick is just insane. But anyway, as bad as Spielberg is, there are probably filmmakers worse than him. Ron Howard, maybe. And then a lot of, people like the Michael Bays, the obvious ones that people recognize as bad. But it shows you that Spielberg and Shakespeare, simply because of their name value, their branding over the centuries or the decades, has led people like this actress, who's I'm sure a nice person, but has no intellectual heft behind her, makes this inane comparison. And on a larger scale, it makes academics try to put Shakespeare beyond reproach, idiots like a Harold Bloom most notably. But in reality, as the decades go on, people like me will stand up and say, no, Shakespeare was a great writer, but he wasn't the greatest writer in English. He wasn't the greatest poet in English. He wasn't the greatest sonneteer in English. He wrote a lot of bad stuff, and it's time people woke up and saw that. So anyway, that's the answer to your question. Thanks for writing.